In 1962, in a small coal town in Pennsylvania, smoke started rising from the ground. At first, nobody thought much of it. Fires weren't unusual in coal country. The town was called Centralia. About 1,400 people lived there. Kids rode their bikes down quiet streets. Neighbors worked the mines. Sunday mornings meant church bells and family dinners. But that year, a landfill fire slipped into an abandoned coal seam beneath the town. And it didn't go out. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The ground began to crack. Toxic gases seeped into basements. One boy nearly fell into a sinkhole that suddenly opened beneath his backyard. The government eventually told families something they never imagined hearing. Your town cannot be saved. One by one, houses were bought. Schools shut down. Streets were torn up. Today, the fire is still burning beneath Centralia, and almost everyone who once called it home is gone. Centralia wasn't the only one. Across America, there are towns that didn't fade slowly. They were erased by one event: a chemical spill, a toxic discovery, a collapsed industry. Places where families went to bed in a normal town and woke up in a place that had no future. Tonight, we're looking at the American towns that disappeared. Not in the 1800s, but in our lifetime. When the fire first started, officials believed it would be routine. A few firefighters, some excavation, problem solved. But this wasn't a surface fire. It had reached the coal veins that ran like arteries beneath the entire town. And once coal catches fire underground, it can burn for decades. Beneath every house, beneath the church, beneath the school playground, there was fire. For years, people tried to live normally, but then the signs became impossible to ignore. Smoke began rising from cracks in the earth. Yards felt warm in winter. Carbon monoxide started seeping into basements. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard. Without warning, the ground opened beneath him. A sinkhole nearly 4 feet wide swallowed him whole. Toxic steam poured from the hole. He barely escaped. The federal government conducted tests. The results were clear. The fire could not be stopped. The air was unsafe. The ground was unstable. Centralia was no longer livable. Imagine hearing that about your hometown. Not because of crime, not because people left for jobs, but because the earth beneath you was on fire. In the 1980s, the government offered to buy the homes. Some residents took the money and left. Others refused. This was where they were born, where their parents were buried. You don't just walk away from that. Over time, houses were bulldozed. The zip code was removed. Roads were closed. Centralia was officially disincorporated. But the fire still burns today. Experts say it could burn for another 100 years. There are still a few residents who refuse to leave. They drive past empty lots where homes once stood, past streets that lead nowhere, past memories that no longer have a town attached to them. Centralia didn't die in a war. It didn't die from violence. It died because of a fire no one could see, until it was too late. Centralia burned from beneath. The danger was invisible, but it was always there. The ground was warm. The air was toxic. And eventually, the government told families they had to leave. But what if the danger wasn't underground? What if it was in the dirt on your street, on your children's shoes, in the very soil of your front yard? In the 1970s, Times Beach was a small working-class town along the Merrimack River in Missouri. About 2,000 people lived there. It wasn't wealthy. It wasn't famous. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, where kids walked to school, where summer meant bikes and baseball. But Times Beach had a problem. The roads were dusty. In dry weather, clouds of dirt would blow through town. So city officials hired a waste oil hauler to spray the roads, something many towns did at the time to keep dust down. It seemed practical, cheap, harmless. But that oil was contaminated with something few people had even heard of: dioxin, one of the most toxic chemicals ever studied. For years, families lived on those sprayed streets. Children played in the dirt. Dogs rolled in it. Gardens grew in it. Then animals started getting sick. Horses died on nearby farms. People began reporting strange health issues. At first, no one connected the dots. Then came the moment that made it national news. In December 1982, the Merrimack River flooded, one of the worst floods in the town's history. The water swept through Times Beach, and when it receded, federal investigators tested the soil. The results were shocking. Dioxin levels were hundreds of times higher than considered safe. This wasn't just a contamination issue. This was one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. In 1983, the federal government made a decision that stunned residents. The entire town would be bought out. Every home, every business, every street. People didn't leave because they wanted to. They left because they were told staying could mean cancer, long-term illness, danger for their children. Imagine hearing that. Your house is toxic. Your soil is poison. Your town is finished. Over the next few years, homes were bulldozed, schools were torn down, churches were removed. Times Beach was officially dissolved in 1985. Today, the land is a state park, but the town itself, gone. Two towns, two completely different causes. One burned from beneath, one poisoned from above. Both filled with families who thought they would grow old there. Both erased by one event that changed everything. And there was another town, one that helped America win 2 world wars. A town that once produced the lead used in bullets and industry. A town that was once considered wealthy beyond imagination, until the very thing that made it rich destroyed it. If Centralia burned quietly, and Times Beach was poisoned without warning, Picher was something different. Picher was powerful. In the early 1900s, Picher wasn't struggling. It was booming. The ground beneath it was rich with lead and zinc, metals that built American industry and armed American soldiers. During World War I and World War II, the mines around Picher were producing enormous amounts of lead. Bullets, ammunition, industrial materials. This town wasn't small in importance. It mattered. At one point, the area produced a significant portion of the lead used by the United States military. The town swelled with workers. Money flowed. Families built homes. Schools expanded. Picher wasn't dying. It was thriving. But mining leaves something behind. Massive piles of waste rock, called chat. Gray mountains of crushed mining debris. For decades, those piles sat there. Kids rode bikes over them, played on them, built forts in them. Nobody told them what was in that dust. Lead and other heavy metals. By the 1980s and 1990s, doctors began noticing something alarming. Children in Picher had elevated lead levels in their blood. Not slightly elevated, dangerously elevated. Lead poisoning in children can cause developmental delays, learning disabilities, neurological damage. Parents were told the soil around their homes was contaminated. The playgrounds were contaminated. The yards were contaminated. The chat piles that looked like harmless gray hills? Toxic. The government designated the area part of the Tar Creek Superfund site, one of the most contaminated environmental disaster zones in the country. That label alone was devastating. It meant the contamination was severe. It meant long-term risk. It meant the land itself was compromised. Imagine living in a town that once helped win wars, only to be told it is now one of the most toxic places in America. And then came the tornado. In 2008, a powerful EF4 tornado tore through Picher. Homes destroyed. Buildings flattened. For many residents, it was the final blow. Some had already been considering federal buyouts because of contamination. After the tornado, the decision became easier, or maybe just inevitable. The government offered to purchase homes. Families left. Businesses closed. In 2009, Picher was officially disincorporated. The town ceased to legally exist. A town that once symbolized American strength, reduced to empty streets and contaminated soil. Children who once played in dust that sparkled in the sun, not knowing it carried poison. Centralia burned. Times Beach was poisoned. Picher was sacrificed to industry. 3 towns, 3 different disasters, all within living memory. 3 towns, 3 different disasters. Fire, poison, industry turned against its own people. But beneath all of it, there's a deeper question. There was a time when towns like these were the backbone of the country. Factory whistles at 7 a.m., high school football on Friday nights, the diner where everyone knew your name, the hardware store that had been there for 40 years. You didn't leave small towns. You built your life there. But somewhere between the 1950s and today, something shifted. Some towns were destroyed by disaster. Others were undone by something quieter. No explosion, no contamination, no government evacuation. Just silence. There are towns that didn't burn. They weren't poisoned. The ground beneath them was safe. But something else disappeared. Traffic, opportunity, attention. And without it, the town slowly starved. On the border of Texas and New Mexico sits a tiny place called Glenrio. In the 1940s and 1950s, it was alive. Families driving west, truckers hauling goods, vacationers headed to California. Gas stations lined the road. Neon motel signs flickered at night. Cafes served pie and coffee 24 hours a day. For travelers, Glenrio was a stop. For locals, it was a livelihood. Then the interstate highway system arrived. In the 1970s, Interstate 40 bypassed Glenrio entirely. Not by miles, by just enough. Traffic that once flowed through town vanished almost overnight. Cars no longer needed to stop. Truckers didn't exit. Tourists never saw the neon lights. Businesses began closing one by one. First the small gas station, then the diner, then the motel. No disaster headline, no national emergency, just empty parking lots. Imagine owning a cafe for 25 years, and one day, the cars simply stop coming. By the 1980s, Glenrio was effectively abandoned. Buildings still stand today, signs still hang, but no one lives there anymore. Centralia was forced out by fire, Times Beach by poison, Picher by contamination and storm. Glenrio? Glenrio was erased by progress. And that may be the hardest kind of disappearance. Because nothing dramatic happens. No sirens, no evacuation, just fewer customers, fewer jobs, fewer reasons to stay, until the town becomes a memory. There was a time when you could stand in parts of America and hear the sound of industry for miles, steel being poured, engines being assembled, shift whistles echoing at sunrise. Entire cities were built around factories. And if you had a job inside one of them, you had stability. A house, a pension, a future. In Detroit, auto plants weren't just workplaces. They were lifelines. Companies like Ford and General Motors employed tens of thousands in massive plants. A high school graduate could walk in, get hired, and retire from the same building 30 years later. Middle-class America was built on factory floors. But by the 1970s and 1980s, things began to change. Foreign competition increased. Automation expanded. Production moved elsewhere. Then came plant closures, one announcement at a time. This facility will cease operations. Production is moving. Final shift scheduled. For workers, it didn't feel like economics. It felt personal. You weren't just losing a job. You were losing identity. Neighborhoods built around those factories began to hollow out. Homes went up for sale. Small businesses closed. Schools lost funding. And once again, the silence came. In Pennsylvania, Bethlehem Steel once stood as one of the most powerful steel producers in the world. Steel from Bethlehem helped build bridges, skyscrapers, warships during World War II. It was American industrial strength in physical form. The plant employed tens of thousands at its peak. Generations of families worked there. Then global competition intensified. Imports increased. Costs rose. And in 2003, Bethlehem Steel declared bankruptcy. The furnaces went cold. Massive structures that once glowed with molten metal went dark. Imagine driving past the place your father worked, the place you worked, and seeing it empty. It didn't happen in a single year. It didn't make one headline. But between the 1970s and early 2000s, entire regions of America changed. Manufacturing jobs declined dramatically. Towns built around a single employer suddenly had none. This wasn't a fire. It wasn't poison. It wasn't a tornado. It was restructuring. Globalization. Automation. Corporate decisions made in boardrooms hundreds of miles away. And the people who felt it most were the ones who showed up every day, punched the clock, and believed the work would always be there. Centralia was consumed by fire. Times Beach by chemicals. Picher by its own mining legacy. Glenrio by a highway. Detroit plants by global competition. Bethlehem Steel by a changing world. Different causes, same result. Empty streets. Dark windows. Echoes where there used to be noise. Maybe towns don't always disappear overnight. Sometimes they disappear one shift at a time. One family moving away. One business closing. One school consolidating. Until one day, you drive through and realize the place you remember doesn't exist anymore. For many Americans over 50, this isn't just history. It's memory. It's the factory your uncle worked at, the diner you stopped at on Route 66, the neighborhood that used to be full of kids playing outside. America was built on places like these. Not just the big cities, not just the famous landmarks, but small towns with one main street, one factory, one school, one church. For decades they were full of life. Children running home before dark. Factory whistles marking the rhythm of the day. Friday night lights. Neighbors who didn't lock their doors. And then, In different ways, they faded. Not all at once, but enough that something changed. But here's something else that's true. America has always reinvented itself. Some former factory towns are becoming tech hubs. Old steel mills are now museums and public spaces. Route 66 towns attract travelers chasing nostalgia. Even in places where industry died, communities found new identities. It may not look the same. It may never feel the same. But the story doesn't always end in silence. Still, there are streets in this country where you can stand today and hear nothing but wind. A school where lockers still line the hallway. A church with pews covered in dust. A factory floor where the machines will never turn on again. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear what it used to sound like. That's the part that stays with you. Because towns don't just disappear. Memories don't. Maybe you grew up in one of these places. Maybe you watched your hometown change. Maybe the factory closed, or the highway moved, or the jobs just slowly vanished. If you did, tell us the name of your town. Tell us what it used to be like. What do you remember most? Because history isn't just in books. It's in the places we lived, and in the stories we refuse to forget.